Picture a doctor walking into your hospital room. But instead of a prescription pad, she's holding a weed she pulled from the sidewalk outside. Sounds ridiculous, right? Except here's the thing. In multiple peer-reviewed lab studies, this weed, Biden's pilosa, has shown antimicrobial activity against the exact bacteria that antibiotics are increasingly failing to kill. Methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, MRSA, E. coli, Candida infections that eat through antifungal drugs like they're nothing, and this plant, it just handles them. So why are we still handing out prescriptions that don't work while a weed with centuries of traditional use across Africa, Asia, and South America sits in the dirt outside the hospital? That's the question nobody in mainstream medicine seems to want to answer, because the global antibiotic market is worth over $60 billion a year. You can't patent a weed. You can't charge $200 a pill for something that grows uninvited in your garden. And we're not here to tell you to ditch your doctor and start eating weeds off the sidewalk. But we're going to show you what the science actually says. Not wellness blogs, not folklore, actual published research. Because if a common roadside plant really does what these studies suggest, the fact that it's been sitting in medical obscurity for decades isn't a coincidence. It's a conversation we should have had a long time ago. You've probably walked right past it without giving it a second thought. It pops up in your backyard, along roadsides, in empty lots. Most people yank it out and toss it in the trash. But in dozens of countries around the world, people have been eating it, brewing it into tea, and pressing it onto wounds for generations. It goes by a few names: blackjack, Spanish needle, cobbler's pegs. Officially, it's Biden's pilosa. And those little sticky seeds that cling to your socks after a walk through the grass, that's it. That's the plant we're talking about. Now here's the thing. This isn't some obscure jungle plant that only a handful of researchers have stumbled upon. Biden's pilosa grows on every single inhabited continent. Tropical regions, subtropical zones, even temperate areas where it shouldn't really survive. It shows up anyway. It's incredibly resilient, almost annoyingly so. And the world noticed early. Back in 1975, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the FAO, actually documented this plant as both a food source and a medicinal herb. That's 50 years ago. So this isn't folk medicine from the fringes. It's been on the official radar for half a century. The question is, why hasn't that led anywhere? For thousands of years, people weren't waiting for a prescription. They were walking out their back door and picking this plant. Across 3 continents, completely independently, communities landed on the same plant for the same problems. That's not coincidence. That's a pattern worth paying attention to. In East Africa, traditional healers used Biden's pilosa to bring down fevers and fight off infections that would otherwise spread. Fresh leaves, crushed and applied directly to wounds to stop them from going bad. In parts of Latin America, it was brewed into a tea, a bitter, strong tea, used specifically for urinary tract infections. Women passing this knowledge down through generations long before anyone had a name for E. coli. In Asia, particularly in China and parts of Southeast Asia, it showed up in treatments for hepatitis, for liver inflammation, for malaria-like fevers where the body is basically burning itself out trying to fight something it can't shake. And here's what ties all of this together. These weren't random uses. Every culture that relied on this plant kept coming back to infections, to fever, to the body being under attack. That consistency across completely separate cultures, with no shared medical text, no communication, that's the kind of signal that actually made early pharmacologists stop and say, wait, there might be something real here. So what's actually doing the heavy lifting inside this plant? Biden's pilosa is packed with 2 main classes of compounds, polyacetylenes and flavonoids. These aren't vague, natural goodness buzzwords. These are specific molecules that researchers can isolate, test, and measure. The polyacetylenes are particularly interesting. They're found heavily in the roots and stems, and they've shown direct activity against bacteria, fungi, and even some parasites. They essentially disrupt the structural integrity of microbial cells, kind of like pulling the supports out from under a building. Then you have the flavonoids, and this is where it gets really specific. 3 names you want to know: quercetin, camphorol, and caffeic acid. Quercetin is one of the most studied anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial flavonoids in all of plant science. It interferes with bacterial enzyme systems, stopping them from functioning properly. Camphorol works in a similar lane, but it's also shown particular effectiveness against certain antibiotic-resistant strains. That's not a small thing. And caffeic acid, despite the name, nothing to do with coffee, is a phenolic compound that disrupts bacterial biofilms. Biofilms are basically the protective shields bacteria build around themselves to avoid being killed. Breaking those down is genuinely difficult, even for pharmaceutical antibiotics. Together, these compounds don't just attack bacteria from one angle. They work across multiple pathways simultaneously, and that's actually why resistance is harder to develop against them. So here's where things get really interesting. Researchers have put Biden's pilosa through the ringer in the lab, and it keeps showing up. Multiple studies, not just one, not just 2, have confirmed that this plant has real, measurable antibacterial and antifungal activity. We're talking about extracts from the leaves, the stems, the flowers, all of it going up against some pretty serious pathogens and actually winning. The compounds doing the heavy lifting here are things like polyacetylenes, flavonoids, and phenolic acids. These aren't mysterious folk medicine hand waves. They're identifiable chemicals that scientists can isolate, test, and measure. And when they run those tests, they're seeing inhibition, bacterial growth slowing down, fungal colonies not spreading the way they should, but the part that really stopped me in my tracks, the root extract. Studies have shown antimycobacterial activity against tuberculosis, TB, one of the oldest, most dangerous bacterial infections in human history. Still kills over 1 million people every year worldwide. Now, to be clear, we're not talking about a cure sitting in your backyard. These are lab conditions. The jump from a petri dish to a functioning treatment is enormous. That's real, that matters. But the fact that researchers are even getting these results? With a weed, most people pull out of their gardens without a second thought. That's not nothing. That's actually a pretty big deal. But here's where it gets really interesting. Because Biden's pilosa isn't just fighting bacteria. This plant has a whole other arsenal that most people have never heard about. Let's start with inflammation. Chronic inflammation is at the root of almost every major disease we're dealing with right now. Heart disease, diabetes, autoimmune conditions, all of it. And Biden's pilosa has shown genuine anti-inflammatory activity in multiple studies, not in a vague, hand-wavy way, in measurable, documented ways. Then there's the antioxidant piece. The plant is loaded with flavonoids and polyphenols, compounds that neutralize the kind of oxidative damage that ages your cells and feeds disease. Now get this, it also shows antiviral activity. Researchers have tested it against several viral strains and seen real inhibitory effects. We're not talking about anecdotal folk medicine here. We're talking about peer-reviewed laboratory work. And malaria. Biden's pilosa has been studied as an anti-malarial agent, particularly in parts of Africa where the plant grows wild and pharmaceutical access is limited. The results have been promising enough that scientists keep going back to it. But the piece that really stopped us in our tracks was the immunomodulatory effect. Yes, a long word. When researchers looked at how this plant interacts with macrophages, the immune cells that essentially direct your body's inflammatory response, they found something remarkable. Biden's pilosa can actually shift those macrophages toward an anti-inflammatory state. That's not just suppressing symptoms. That's working with your immune system at a fundamental level. So here's where it gets frustrating. If this plant has all this potential, why isn't your doctor handing you a prescription for Biden's pilosa? Why is it still sitting in the folk remedy category instead of the pharmacy shelf? The honest answer is, the research just isn't there yet. And I mean that in a very specific way. There is currently only one phase 1/2 clinical trial that has actually studied Biden's pilosa in humans. Just one. For context, a drug typically needs to clear multiple phases of rigorous human trials before anyone in medicine takes it seriously. We're talking years of data, thousands of participants, safety profiles, dosage thresholds. Biden's is barely at the starting line of that process. But here's what makes it even messier. A lot of the lab studies that do exist, and there are hundreds of them, aren't really talking about the same thing. Because Biden's pilosa isn't a pill with a controlled milligram count. It's a plant. And depending on where it was grown, what part was used, how it was extracted, what solvent was used, you can end up with wildly different chemical profiles. One study's extract might have twice the polyacetylene concentration of another study's extract. So when results contradict each other, it's not always because the plant failed. It's because the researchers weren't even testing the same thing. That inconsistency is a massive roadblock. Science needs repeatability. And right now, Biden's can't fully deliver that. Now, before you run out and start brewing this stuff by the handful, let's talk about who should absolutely not be using Biden's pilosa without serious medical supervision. First, if you're pregnant or breastfeeding, skip it. We don't have enough safety data, and that's not a risk worth taking. When it comes to anything going into your body during pregnancy, the answer is always, talk to your doctor first. If you have hypoglycemia, meaning your blood sugar already runs low, this plant can push it lower. That might sound great if you're dealing with high blood sugar, but if you're already on the lower end, we're talking dizziness, confusion, even fainting. That's a real problem. And here's something that doesn't get mentioned enough. If you're already taking diabetes medications, metformin, insulin, anything in that category, Biden's pilosa can actually amplify those effects. You could end up with blood sugar that drops too far, too fast. That's not a minor inconvenience. That can be dangerous. Same caution applies if you have heart conditions. Some of the compounds in this plant affect cardiovascular function, and layering that on top of existing heart medications is not something to do casually. The bottom line here is this. Natural does not mean harmless. Biden's pilosa is genuinely powerful, and that power cuts both ways. Use it with guidance from someone who actually knows your health history. And here's where things get really interesting. Because while your doctor still can't write you a prescription for Biden's pilosa, researchers aren't sitting on their hands. Right now, there are ongoing trials happening in countries like Japan, South Korea, and across parts of Europe. Scientists are looking at standardized extracts, dosing protocols, specific compounds, the kind of rigorous work that moves a plant from folk remedy to something a hospital might actually take seriously. That momentum is real, and it's building. The challenge is time. Clinical trials take years, regulatory approval takes even longer, and pharmaceutical companies aren't exactly rushing to fund research on a plant that anyone can grow in their backyard. So what do you do in the meantime? You don't just wait. Look, there's a reason people in Africa, Asia, and Latin America have been using this plant for generations. That knowledge doesn't disappear while we wait for a double-blind study to catch up. You can start exploring now. Teas made from the leaves, standardized extracts available through reputable herbal suppliers, even fresh preparations in some regions. But, and this matters, don't go rogue with it. Talk to a naturopath, an integrative medicine doctor, someone who actually knows plant-based medicine. especially if you're on other medications, because Biden's pilosa does interact with certain drugs. The future of this plant looks genuinely promising. The question is whether you're willing to be informed while that future unfolds. So, Biden's pilosa, look for it. Quite a fascinating little plant growing, perhaps somewhere near you. We believe that wellness begins with the choices we make every day, how we nourish our bodies, care for our minds, connect with nature, and create healthy, meaningful lives. At Wellness Studio, we explore practical ways to live well through historical and wellness proportions, healthy practices, real food, natural living, mindfulness, sustainable practices, and everyday habits that support long-term health and happiness. Our goal is to make wellness simple, accessible, and inspiring for everyone. Whether you're growing herbs on a windowsill, preparing healthier meals, seeking balance in a busy world, or simply looking for new ways to feel your best, you'll find ideas, knowledge, and encouragement here. Wellness isn't about perfection. It's about progress, curiosity, and building a life you love, one step at a time. Please join our community as we learn, grow, and thrive together. Oh, and please feel free to like or comment on this video and consider subscribing to our channel. Thanks for watching.